Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to the final capstone session for Office 365 CON 2020. We're very pleased to have Michael Osterman of Osterman Research join us to wrap up today's conference. Michael is the principal of Osterman Research, founded in 2001. Since that time, the company has become one of the leading analyst firms in the messaging and collaboration space, providing research, analysis, white papers, and other services to companies like Hewlett-Packard, IBM, Google, Symantec, Dell, and many others. Prior to founding Osterman Research, Michael was the Vice President of Market Research at Creative Networks, a leading market research and consulting firm focused on the messaging and directory markets. Michael is a frequent speaker at industry and vendor-sponsored events on the topics of archiving, messaging, social media, and other messaging and collaboration-focused issues. So welcome, Michael, and thank you for joining us at Office 365 CON.
Well, Roger, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the research we've done recently. So just a little more about Osterman Research so you get a level set on where we're coming from in all of this. As Roger mentioned, we're an independent market research and consulting firm, and we do a lot of primary research with IT decision makers and influencers. And we'll be going through quite a bit of that here today on a recent project that we did. We really focus on the way that people communicate or collaborate. So we focus on things like security, archiving, content management, encryption, essentially any technology or any process that enables people to work together in the context of the workplace. The company's about 19 years old, and we're located in Western Washington. So here's an examination of the people we spoke to for the survey. These were IT decision makers and influencers in companies of all sizes, but mostly mid-sized and large companies. And as you can see here, before the COVID-19 pandemic, about 1 out of 5 people in the IT space were working from home, maybe partially, maybe full-time. And IT is one of those kinds of jobs that in many cases allows you to do at least some of your work from home. Today, 89% of people are working from home. And so this is really a huge shift that occurred over a very short period of time, literally just about 3 or 4 weeks. We also found that in-office work has plummeted. It consists mainly of like a skeleton support staff to support people in the field, to support servers, other on-premises infrastructure, and so forth. But largely, we've seen this massive shift toward work from home for IT and related staff. We also found that for the overall general employee population, prior to the pandemic, about 18% of employees were working from home. Today, that's 80%. So we're looking at really this complete shift that caught almost every IT department off guard. They just weren't prepared for it. They weren't prepared for having millions of people now working from home. And it's had some interesting impacts on network bandwidth because largely people are relying on the residential internet infrastructure that they weren't relying on before. And so we've seen a lot of problems. Largely it's held up pretty well, but there have been a number of problems. But fundamentally, we see this as continuing for at least the next month or two, with most employees working from home or in some other remote capacity. Now, it's not surprising that the biggest concern for the sudden work from home environment is going to be something security related. We found that almost half of IT decision makers and influencers are really concerned that hackers are going to try to take advantage of the situation, increasing the threat of cyber attacks. And we've seen this. We've seen this massive increase in phishing attacks. We've seen new types of ransomware. We've seen really new and varied ways for bad actors to try to penetrate employees, essentially, because they are now really the first line of defense. Whatever perimeter was there before has pretty much evaporated because people are now working from home outside the auspices of a corporate environment where they have usually better security, more firewalls, that kind of thing. We also found that over a third of IT decision makers and influencers are really concerned about employee errors, things like opening a phishing email that may contain a link to a ransomware site. Sort of general phishing that's maybe not quite as damaging as ransomware, maybe some other kind of email cyber attack. About a third of organizations, a third of IT decision makers and influencers are really concerned about the overall risk profile of the organization because of COVID-19 and this massive growth of the remote workforce. And they should be. Again, most decision makers really weren't prepared for this kind of eventuality. And so this pretty much caught people off guard. And so there are a lot of security issues that they have to deal with they really hadn't anticipated dealing with, at least in such a short period of time. We also found that a lot of concern is around the risk of data loss, and we'll get into that here in just a bit in the context of archiving data in terms of security and so forth. But a lot of decision makers and influencers are really quite concerned about data loss because now communications are really happening outside the normal email channel or outside the normal face-to-face channel that you'd find in most organizations. And again, email and data backup and recovery are just not adequate for a remote workforce. About a quarter of the decision makers and influencers are really very concerned about that. So how prepared were organizations? Well, this took us a little bit by surprise because we found that about 1 out of 5 organizations considered themselves to be very well prepared. And what's interesting is that this matches very closely with the number of people who were actually working from home before the pandemic started. So organizations that already had a work from home model that allowed employees to work at least partially from home were already much better prepared because they had the infrastructure in place. They had thought about security and how data is going to be backed up. They had thought about VPNs and other remote access technologies, unlike the vast majority of organizations that were sort of forced into this whole work from home scenario without any real preparation. Overall, companies were pretty well prepared. I mean, here we're showing a little over 50% felt that they were actually pretty well prepared or very well prepared. But really a large percentage were not. This caught them completely off guard, and now they're to some extent flying blind because they're relying on employee infrastructure that really just isn't up to snuff. What we have found in past research is that decision makers, really haven't prepared their employees to work from home all that well. They haven't enabled them with good antivirus technologies. They haven't imposed VPN requirements on remote users and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of users just, get onto their residential internet network and start working oftentimes from infrastructure that's not really very well prepared. What we also found in the research is that data is just not being properly backed up in many organizations. We found that fewer than 3/4 of organizations are backing up all of their corporate data as they were before. 26% are backing up only some of their data, and 2% are not backing up their data at all. And so what we're finding is that a lot of corporate data is being generated by employees just as it was before the pandemic started, but now it's not being backed up properly. So that if there is a crash of somebody's home computer or they lose a mobile device, that means that a lot of corporate data is going to be lost. That's going to have serious ramifications down the road in terms of being able to make employees more productive, being compliant with a variety of privacy regulations and other types of regulations and so forth. What we also found is that for archiving, things are actually even worse. Only about 3 out of 5 organizations are archiving all of the data as they were before the pandemic. About a third are archiving only a portion of it, and 10% aren't archiving at all. And this is going to have even more serious ramifications because if you look at requirements for GDPR, the California Consumer Privacy Act, HIPAA, FERPA, regardless of whatever regulation you're under, you have to retain some of your records. And so you're going to have to be able to produce these at some point in the future for a lawsuit, for a regulatory audit, maybe just for information for other employees that are going to have access to this corporate content. And in many cases, it's simply not going to be there. So we feel that long term, this is going to be one of the more serious ramifications from the pandemic, because people just aren't archiving their data as they should. Either it's on employees' home infrastructure, it's on their mobile devices, but in many cases, it's just not in a corporate archive as it's supposed to be. And this is going to come back to bite organizations hard at some point in the future. One of the things we found that was fairly surprising in the research is that for some organizations, the pandemic has actually improved their normal operations. That really did take us by surprise because we hadn't expected more than maybe 1 or 2% to report the things that improved for them. But we did find that, it was a fairly significant percentage, as you can see here, that it either improved or dramatically improved. And we think part of the reason for this is because as employees are working from home, they have less commute time, perhaps they can work longer hours, they can work more varied hours, and so they potentially can be more responsive to other employees, to clients, to prospects, and so forth. We did find, however, and again, this was not surprising, that for the vast majority of organizations, this has had a fairly serious impact on their operations. 7 out of 10 reported that they've either been seriously impaired or had some kind of a modest negative impact from the whole shutdown and forcing employees to work from home and so forth. And we would expect over time that organizations will adapt to this new paradigm, that they will find that they can at least get back to zero so that they can have relatively little impact from employees working from home and so forth. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is that, a lot of organizations are seriously impaired, and this is probably going to continue for some time. One of the interesting things we found in the research, too, is really the whole impact of the pandemic on organizations' migration to the cloud. We asked, are you going to be moving more to the cloud as a result of this? Because you do need a more resilient workforce, one that doesn't necessarily have to be in an office or one that can be called out of the office on a moment's notice. And what we found is that for about a third of organizations that said, yes, we are moving more to the cloud because of this. So they'll move more to cloud-based infrastructure of various types, cloud-based servers, cloud-based applications, and so forth. However, the plurality, 34%, said, no, it's not going to have an impact because we're there already. So what we can assume is that for the vast majority of organizations, roughly about 2/3, this whole pandemic is having a very positive impact on the cloud because more and more applications will be going there, more data will be going there, and so forth. However, we did find that for 28% of the organizations, they said, no, it's just not going to have that much of an impact in terms of our migration to the cloud, because we want to keep things on premises. And there are a number of good reasons to do that, from a security perspective, a regulatory perspective, and so forth. And so we'll continue to see a lot of on-premises infrastructure, but one of the real long-term ramifications, we think, is going to be more and more migration to the cloud. About 1 out of 14 organizations just wasn't sure at this point, because we did catch people in early April, so it was sort of early stages of the whole work from home phenomenon. One of the interesting things we found in the research as well is that there's going to be an impact on future work from home as a result of this pandemic and the current work from home scenario. We did find that, a fair number of organizations are going to want everybody back in the office or working as they were before, so people will want to return to the status quo. However, 27% of organizations said we're going to want more employees to remain remote. This is working out well for us, for a variety of reasons. It's less expensive. There are other benefits for employee productivity, employee, work-life balance, and so forth. So we're going to want more employees to be remote after this whole thing is over. 18% said, yes, they'll want to implement some sort of a new work-from-home policy for at least part of the week for their employees to allow them to, work maybe 1 or 2 days at home, the rest of the time in the office, and so forth. 1 out of 10 organizations, though, said they're going to want the majority of their employees to remain remote. They just want people to actually be able to work from home or otherwise remotely, maybe in some sort of remote workspace. So we think this is going to have some very long-term ramifications, because although this was thrust on organizations, really quite suddenly, a lot of organizations are seeing some real benefits here. A lot of employees are seeing real benefits here. And certainly we're in a state of flux right now, and these numbers are subject to change as things get back to something of a new normal. But we think that this is going to have a major impact on the whole work from home phenomenon. We had seen that in past years with companies like IBM and Yahoo, and they retracted on that, pulled people back into centralized locations. But we think this is going to have the opposite effect, that it's going to push more employees out into their homes or other remote workspaces long term. We also asked about, where are organizations going to be implementing new technologies, new processes? What are the priorities that they're going to be focusing on moving forward as a result of this whole work from home phenomenon? Well, not surprisingly, email security was at the top of the list for investment. Email security today is lacking in a lot of organizations, and particularly so in the context of work from home. When people are suddenly working from home and using their own email or using their corporate email remotely, there are a lot of email security issues that have come up. Phishing has increased many, many times. Again, as I mentioned before, new ransomware strains and so forth. So email security is going to be the fundamental investment area moving forward. Remote access, not surprisingly, a very close second. Organizations are going to need a VPN or some other kind of remote access to be able to enable their employees to work securely, so that corporate data is protected, so that security is enhanced, and so forth. Web security is another key area for investment, again, largely because employees are often on the web, and this is one of the major threat vectors for malicious content to get into an organization. Organizations are also going to be focusing on things like endpoint security, application security, deploying more cloud servers, and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of positive investment areas in the context of how organizations are going to respond to the whole pandemic situation. And we expect that although near-term investment is going to fall in these areas, for obvious reasons, as organizations have less revenue and so forth, long-term, this is going to be a real boon for the areas that you see here. So in summary, the suddenness of the whole need for employees to work from home it really was a shock to most organizations. Very few saw it coming. Most were really largely unprepared for it. However, a small percentage have actually thrived, and we expect that to continue to increase over time as more organizations get used to the whole notion of their employees working from home. They're making the appropriate investments to make that secure, to archive their data, to back up their data properly, and so forth. And we think there are going to be some really profound changes for a lot of organizations following this whole crisis. Here's our contact information if you would like to follow up or get a copy of the white paper we've recently produced. That wraps up my part of the presentation. Roger, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for sharing the latest Osterman research insights, which have an impact on all of us and may have an impact for the foreseeable future. This concludes today's online conference hosted by Techgenics. Please watch your email for the next Techgenics online conference coming in October of 2020. We thank all of you for joining us today. Please be safe until then. You may now disconnect from this final session. Thank you.